When you really think about it, the idea of disclosure has been with the UFO field since the very beginning, since we've known about flying saucers in the 1940s. We just haven't called it disclosure. Back in the 50s, back in the 60s, there were other words used to describe this idea that we needed to end secrecy on the subject of UFOs. Back in those days, in the United States, there was an organization known as NICAP that was run by Major Donald Kehoe. And Kehoe was the guy back then who was just fighting the fight to end UFO secrecy, what we would call disclosure. It's never stopped. Through the 1970s, it continued. New people came onto the scene, and they also were pushing for some form of openness, the end of secrecy, again, what we would call disclosure. Through the 80s, through the 90s, and into the 21st century, when we finally started using that phrase, disclosure. It's never stopped. It's always been an issue. It's always been something that UFO researchers and activists have been striving for. And the question is, will we ever have disclosure? And the question really is, will we ever have a moment in our world where this subject of UFOs is openly acknowledged by all elements of our society, including all of our scientific establishments and political institutions? Because that's really what we mean when we talk about disclosure. It's disclosing the reality of this from a previous mode of secrecy, right? Well, I'll just say this. To understand whether we can have disclosure, I often like to rewind the clock, so to speak, and look at the past, and to look at how UFO secrecy seems to have begun. And so I like to go back to the 1940s and look at the presidency of Harry Truman. He was the US president from 1945 to 1953. And it was under Harry Truman's presidency within the US that this whole matter of flying saucers became a really important public issue. And it's also during that period of time when we can really see that the secrecy apparatus around UFOs really took root. You go back to 1947 to events like Roswell, New Mexico. Did a flying saucer crash there with alien bodies recovered? Did something similar happen the following spring in Aztec, New Mexico, not far away, with yet more alien bodies? There are a number of these other crash retrieval incidents that appear to have taken place, and if you believe that they happened, and I do believe that at least some of them happened, then you're facing a really interesting situation here. If you're the president of the United States, this information is going to come to you, obviously, and then you have to make a decision. Do you tell the world? Do you tell the world that you have recovered this exotic technology and these alien bodies? And I think the instinct of most of us, looking at the matter with a lot of historical perspective and distance, we would say, yes, we're going to tell the world. If this were to happen, the world has a right to know. And I would agree with that, absolutely. And it's very possible that Harry Truman might have agreed with that too. But Harry Truman was in a really tough spot because he'd be surrounded by advisors, all of whom I'm sure would say, bad idea, bad idea. All right, you tell the world that this is real, what's going to happen? A, you don't even know who these other beings are. You don't even know if they're friendly or not. So what are you going to tell the world? You're just going to get people worked up over nothing? B, this is seriously advanced technology. Are you willing to share this technology with everyone else in the world, including the Russians, including any other potential adversaries that come up? Because let's face it, you're not willing to share atomic technology with the rest of the world. And in 1947, just to give you some perspective, the United States still had a monopoly of atomic bombs in the world. No one else had atomic bombs in 1947 except the US. And the United States was absolutely not willing, I can assure you, not willing to share its atomic technology with any other nation. If they were not willing to share atomic technology, I think we can probably assume they were not willing to share something as exotic as alien technology. So that would be problem number 2. And problem number 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 would be, how bad would public panic be? How bad would public panic be? How badly would this affect our energy infrastructure? You know, if these objects are using something other than petroleum to move around, would this pose a short or medium or long-term risk to the very profitable petroleum industry that the entire world is using to move its infrastructure? Like, do we really want to upset that? And on and on and on and on. So there are a lot of questions that would come up, and it is very likely that President Harry Truman back in the 1940s would say, you know what, let's keep this quiet for now. We'll study it for now. We will review the situation every so often and decide if and when we are going to disclose any of this reality to the rest of the world. That's how the secrecy starts. The president might say, you're in charge of managing the media. You're in charge of understanding all of the scientific implications of this phenomenon. You're in charge of understanding who these other beings are and do we have anything to worry about, and on and on and on. So that's the team, and over time the tasks become allocated in various ways to create an entire structure of secrecy. People think that's impossible. Well, I would say study the world of secrecy for a little while and then guess again. It is entirely possible and happens all the time that secrets are kept for years and years, and indeed can be kept indefinitely and often are. So the UFO secret begins in the 1940s, and it continues and it deepens. And the problem with this structure of secrecy is that it appears to have become very largely privatized. And it doesn't mean that it's moved 100% out of all government authority, particularly relating to the United States government. But it does appear that a lot of this knowledge, a lot of the money, a lot of the profit as well, really accrues to private industry within the UFO secrecy. And when I say profit, I mean real profit. Because what's going on here, just understand this scenario. The government, the army acquires an artifact, whether it's a craft or whether it's a piece of technology, that now needs to be studied. It needs to be exploited. It needs to be understood scientifically. How is this done? Well, the military itself has some very brilliant minds working within it, without a doubt. But the real scientifically brilliant minds are all in private industry. That's where the money is. That's where the brain power is. And so what happens inevitably is that the Army or the Air Force or the Navy or whatever branch of government hands off a piece of technology to a private contractor under conditions of extreme security and secrecy. And the question really becomes, who owns that technology? Well, that's a question for lawyers who hammer out their arrangements within the classified world, I'm sure, very, very exactly. But what you really have over time is a situation where ownership over technology and ownership over the information, the data, slowly but surely, I think, becomes transferred to private entities. And, you know, if you step outside of the UFO scenario and you just look at how the United States government bureaucracy works, it's really the same way. You see that the power resides more and more in private entities that are standing behind the government. It's not the government agencies or the government elected officials, for goodness sake, who really wield the power. It's the money behind the state, what some people call the deep state, which has been discussed for many, many years and decades. So that's, I think, the situation we're looking at vis-a-vis the UFO part of the problem. That is, UFO tech increasingly gets privatized. Now, from a disclosure point of view, this presents some serious problems. You know, one question is, how much can any president of the United States do relating to this matter? I'll tell you a story. About 12 years ago, I had a conversation with a very prominent man from within the US intelligence community who knew a great deal about the UFO subject, a very, very great deal. An extremely articulate, intelligent man who knew multiple US presidents, multiple heads of the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, multiple heads of the Defense Department, and so forth. This man is plugged in very, very well to the upper echelon of American national security. And he happened to have a deep knowledge of the UFO subject to boot. So very interesting person. And I happened to talk to him and I said, hey, I would like to ask you, how much do presidents know about UFOs? And he said, well, some have known more than others, because it's not all the same. And he just gave me a list. He said Jimmy Carter knew, Ronald Reagan knew, George Bush Sr. knew. According to this man, he was strongly of the opinion that Bill Clinton did not get a formal briefing on UFOs, and nor did George W. Bush. Now, I happen to have this particular conversation during the later part of the George W. Bush presidency, so we didn't talk about Barack Obama or Donald Trump. But his assessment was pretty clear anyway, which was presidents come and go. Presidents have to kiss the babies, be in front of the cameras, they've got to meet with reporters, they've got to read their talking points. They have thousands of things that they have to do in very, very public light. And nearly all of the important things that go on in government are below the surface, done in countless special access programs, that is, black budget programs with virtually no real government oversight whatsoever, except under the most limited basis. And he just asked me, how much do you think any president is really going to be able to manage all of this mountain of secret programs? I mean, the answer is almost not at all. And some presidents try harder than others to be on top of all of that. But it's the bureaucrats, it's the lifers within these programs that are really running things. Even within government programs, the question is, how much control do they have over the UFO problem, over the UFO phenomenon, over the technology, over gaining scientific information about this, over collecting all the relevant data on this? It's not really clear which formal government agency does all of this. There are still many, many ultra-secret US government agencies that could very well have a great deal of information on this, from the NSA to the NRO to any number of probably still secret organizations and programs that exist that we have no idea about. Keep in mind that the NSA existed for many, many years before anyone knew that it did exist, and the same is with the NRO, the National Reconnaissance Office, which officially manages all spy satellites that we have, and which was a felony for a member of Congress to mention for over 30 years until it was finally outed in the 1990s. Amazing. So that's the history of the American classified world, is that we have entire departments that have existed in total secrecy without people even knowing about their existence. So now when you're looking at the UFO situation, and we're talking about disclosure, it's a really fair question to ask, who has got the information to disclose?